Thanks very much. Romilly Greenhill from ODI. Two questions. Firstly, unless I missed something, those last two presentations seem entirely inconsistent with each other. We had Colombia fully integrated, you'd used it in the national planning, you'd set benchmarks, against regions and international experience. It seemed fully integrated. So I would kind of like you guys to talk to each other, and maybe Carolina to explain how that became integrated, if there aren't strong incentives otherwise. It's the first question. The second one is, we talked yesterday a lot about, the SDG agenda is becoming much broader. There's 17 goals. There's lots of different targets proposed. Could that not be helpful in terms of countries picking and choosing and saying, actually, my priority is infrastructure, water and climate or something. So those are the things that I'm going to focus on. And so I get the data and I get the benchmarking and I get the support potentially to do that. And maybe other things are less important. I don't know the answer, but I'd be interested in people's reflections on, could the wider agenda actually help it to be more owned at country level? Because bearing in mind what you're saying about ownership, Philip, but to have more political support, because countries could pick and choose amongst that menu.
Thank you, Romilly. Rebecca at the back.
Rebecca Simpson from LSE. I just wanted to sort of ask Neil and Carolina if they were willing to speculate a bit about the counterfactual. Do you think development achievements would have been significantly different in your two countries without the MDG agenda?
Not sure it was a bit low, the volume. Maybe we can put it up a little. More? Dirk. And John.
Thank you, Dirk de Velde, ODI. I had a lot of interest in all the presentations, but I wanted to ask a question about the last presentation.
The monsters.
Sorry? about the last presentation, which is related to sort of the link between international agreements and ownership. I don't see the sort of the SDG agenda as one that is similar to, like, say, a trade agreement or something like that actually imposes certain things. It's more like a signaling device. At least that's my view. Although I don't think it's necessarily picking and choosing. I think the idea behind it is that there's now a balanced overview of sort of social, economic, and environmental goals that countries collectively would implement it in a balanced manner, not just only pick and choose one that I mentioned, but whether that happens is we don't know, of course. But the question is one about trade agreement or about agreements and ownership, and I think that sometimes the point of an agreement is to limit ownership, and that's the whole point behind it. So, for instance, a trade agreement, I would love the EU and other countries to stop subsidizing or subsidizing farmers so much and to spend it on silly things. So, if you want to limit their ownership so that it's good for the EU and for development. So, and that of course is somewhere that also applies in other settings. So I think the whole point is that you want to limit the ownership of countries to do silly things, right? So I hope that fits into your sort of ideas.
Thank you. I've got two more, Johnny and then Marcus, and then maybe we'll get back to the panel for an initial set of answers.
I'm only asking a question because there weren't other hands.
Well, no, okay.
I'm the default questioner. I thought that was a brilliant presentation, Philip, and I disagree with it on so many levels. I think we can only really have finished this in the pub. But, I mean, you made some very, very good points, but I think really I buy what Dirk said, which is that, the SDGs is not about precisely what you were saying it was about. It's more about signalling and helping, and in a very, very, very small way, can these things that are decided in New York make any difference to people, really? And I think, perhaps they can. And that's what my question is going to be. I can't avoid also just discussing Colombia, as it's been mentioned, where I've been living for the last few years. And it just so happens that there have been great, stats at least, in improvements in poverty, which is why Colombia comes up well there, in a period of time in which the government of the day is currently being accused, and was always accused, and now the ex-president is more and more being accused of very, very serious human rights abuses. And one also thinks of immediately in that context of Ethiopia, which is one of the kind of emblematic, I'm sure within ODI we have constant discussions. I remember going to a Ethiopia kind of commemoration of Meles, actually, and the British aid establishment was out in force. Gordon Brown came along. Not one of them, except indeed Mark Malloch Brown, mentioned the human rights questions, at least, and very serious questions about Meles, because development was such a strong story in Ethiopia. Development is quite a strong story in Colombia, at least in terms of extreme poverty reduction. And it just strikes me that if the SDGs is a signalling mechanism, and if it's an incentivizing mechanism, should I be worried, should we be worried, that there isn't enough in there on simple, basic individual human rights? In my view, and I wrote a little column about this a few years ago, development can be done ethically, and it actually can be done unethically. In other words, you can achieve MDG-style progress in a very unethical way. And by that I mean really nasty human rights abuses.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested if maybe that's an area that's missing currently from the SDGs. I'm not suggesting adding any more, I don't think.
Thank you, John. There is one more, Marcus Brint, and then we'll close this ODI round of questions. So the next round, I'm only going to accept questions from outside of ODI. There was also Marcus afterwards. Marcus, we'll come to you in a minute, okay?
Okay, thank you. Bryn Wellham, a research fellow at ODI. I've got 3 points, but I'll be really quick. The first one with Philip's presentation, just to echo what Dirk has said and also what Johnny has said. I mean, I wonder if the interpretation of domestic governments and politics is a little bit one-sided. I mean, politics in all countries is plural. There are contested meanings, contested definitions. So if you were to assume a monolithic government, they might well reject the SDGs, but they could well strengthen the hand of other forces within the government, which could be positive. Secondly, I'm interested in what Carolina said about data and just the act of, what I think you said, it'd be interesting to hear, just the act of gathering baseline data and comparing that across different regions, different states. You hinted that made a difference, all of that got people to think. I'd be interested to hear more. And a very nerdy budget point, I'd be fascinated to hear how you did a 15-year budget projection allocating all the expenditure to different MDGs for 15 years, because I think that would be something that the UK Treasury, where I used to work, would struggle to do.
Thank you, Marcus, and then I will go back to the panel.
Thank you. Yes, it's very nice to be talked about the diversity of this audience. I think, of course, when we talk about we, most of us are basically referring to ODI people who work in ODI, who used to work in ODI, who want to work in ODI, who just about to leave ODI. But yes, point taken. I think the other point, the diversity, is that, like Jonathan, who I normally disagree violently with, I do also have this time disagree violently with Philip, but I agree that's probably a conversation around the pub, which we look forward to having. In terms of the questions, I just wanted to ask 3 very specific questions to the panel. So to Neil, I'd be really interested to know what you think is the level of ownership, in the sense that you see it from your perspective, of the MDGs and of the potential SDGs. You know, you're there in the middle of all the budget directors across Africa, and I would be interested to know what extent do you think that they own this. To Carolina, I'd be really interested to know more about just the whole financing process, and how that took off, and what was the process that enabled greater ownership of MDGs. I was very struck by your comment, the shock that we didn't actually have this information, and therefore to what extent data was actually part of that ownership or integration process. And then to Philip, I wonder whether actually the picture is a bumblebee. It's one of these sort of impossible things that really shouldn't fly, but sort of does, which is quite curious. And particularly whether actually SDGs are more like the 0.7 target. I mean, again, the 0.7 target shouldn't work. It's 40 years out of date, but actually none of us are proposing jettisoning it. And whether the SDGs are more, to go back to a theoretical analysis, about behavioral economics, and this is about an anchor that does actually provide some sort of pull to lots of people, but shouldn't be interpreted at all like a Montreal or a World Trade Agreement. I just wonder whether that's an analogy that chimes. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go back to the panel now. Maybe, Carolina, you go first. I'll let Philip have a bit of time to round off his thoughts about the challenge on ownership.
Okay, so I guess, there were many questions, but I think I can talk overall about So how it became integrated? I guess the message I wanted to send, and that is the reality we lived, is we already had in place a structure that allowed to set strategies, to define policies, and to allocate resources to policies. And then the MDGs appeared, and then we said, okay, in this institutionality that we already have, with the instruments, with players, with decision-making process, how do we mainstream MDGs? And that's why it took long, because it was very interesting, because then you have for example, in that case, the UN Nations agency saying, no, you have to follow exactly this. And we were like, no, that's not what we think it's our goal. It's related to that, but what in our policy, what we want to achieve is this, and therefore we have to find a intermediate point. One example, poverty. For us, $1.25 is not a figure. You cannot measure Colombia poverty 1.25 per day, because then population will say to us, you are crazy. So our standard is much higher. So that's just one example in every single sector. So we used institutionality we had, and that was the message I wanted to send here, is countries that have institutionalities are that allow this policy making, allocation of resources, and I link both of them, are a way ahead of other countries that have to figure out how to get ownership of, as in this case, international agendas that allow them to get resources or allow us to get resources, but that have to fit into the system. So here, one is, it's a complete recognition that institutionality is important, and capacity. That was one of the issues that I think was mentioned. Financing crucial, but without the rest, I would not have seen how we could have done it. The counterfactual. So, I mean, counterfactual in the sense of, we didn't have an experiment or anything like that in which we would like to have a counterfactual. But I think what we have is trends on improvement, and sometimes went back and forth, because the other thing is, MDGs, if you measure them every single year, sometimes you are good and sometimes you are bad. In between this, we had a huge economic crisis, poverty. What we had gained went back 15 percentage points, and then you have to start again. So the thing is that what it allowed is continuity of policies, and I think that's an important issue of MDGs or SDGs, is because development is a continuous process with ups and downs. This long-term vision, long-term goal setting, and continuity and persistence, I think it's important. How do we project expenditure in the long term? We have methodologies, because 99 the economic crisis, we negotiated an agreement with the IMF. Part of the agreement was we had to produce a way of figuring out how much was going to be our expenditure. Part of that, we then got a fiscal responsibility law, medium-term expenditure framework. All of that allows you to use it as tools for projecting the expenditure. So you have the need. For example, you take one goal that has to do with coverage of education, coverage of health. You calculate how much people you are missing, how are you going to include them year by year, and then you just put it in the medium-term expenditure framework. So it's just a budgeting tool that we used. So the numbers are not 1% correct, but it gives you a sense of dimension. Human rights. Well, I disagree with the with part of the comment about. I mean, first, I don't think there was any. MDGs didn't create abuses in human rights or anything like that. I mean, I think MDGs were focused in some things, and on the other hand, and I said it very strongly, Colombia had many other policies in place. One was the policy of democratic security, as was labeled, from 2002 to 2010. As part of that policy, there's a whole discussion on issues on how the army and the police recovered the state. That is, it's one of the policy issues. It's one of the topics. whether it should be part of an SDG agenda. I mean, the world can have as many goals as the world wants to have. I don't know how many you can achieve that way. But I will never say that there was an issue of human rights violation or abuses because of MDGs or SDGs or any of the Colombian policies, not even the democratic security policy. And I think part of the problem we are right now is trying to solve the crisis and negotiating with FARC, under FARC doing constant abuses to human rights every single day while the negotiation is going on. So it's just the way our country works. Data, active gathering, yeah. I think one of the best outcomes for Colombia of this exercise was the recognition of the importance of having data. Because it takes a lot of effort and it's very boring to produce data. Is not like the most exciting task that a government has. So this kind of gave it a flavor that made it more nicer, I think. I think that's it.
Thank you, Neil.
So I have an 11-year-old son that's also into mythical creatures and characters. And, you know, if he's going to turn out as smart as Philip, I'm going to encourage him to continue with this fascination of his. Let me answer the counterfactual and ownership question in the same response. We had Alan Schick last year, who joined us via video conference. And I remember Alan saying something maybe 10 or so years ago when I first met him. And he said there are two types of projects that, and he was referring to a development bank that I won't mention, because I'm sharing a panel with the bank.
Who could that be? I
So
wonder.
Alan was saying that there are two types of projects that a development bank gets involved in. The one is a success whether the bank's involved in it or not, and the other is a failure whether the bank is involved in it or not. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? Because it speaks to this point about ownership. That, I mean, a developing country needs to agree that it wants to tackle poverty. Whether there are MDGs in place or SDGs in place. And the success of attaining the country goals that it has set for itself is not going to be because there's an international agreement. It's more likely to happen if the country has, and I mean, you know, Philip and I would have to speak a bit later about, I mean, this issue of country ownership, so that I fully understand what it is that he is putting across. But I mean, and it's not so much about the ownership of the SDGs. I think it's about the things that we need to do to achieve some of those goals that we need to take ownership of. So it's the policies that are derived out of that. I think it's the allocation of resources that are going to be made available, domestic and international, that there needs to be ownership of. It's the procurement of the goods and services that are going to, you know, build the schools and provide teachers that countries need to take ownership of. And I think if there's a commitment to that, you know, whether there are MDGs or SDGs, it's not really going to matter. But I'm not saying that, you know, in these MDGs and SDGs are entirely unnecessary. I think that, you know, like as in the case of climate change, I think it's beneficial to have these global commitments to something. I think it does help with the focus, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you now need to have in your country budget a line that says we're allocating X amount to the following SDG. Thanks.
Philip.
Thanks. first of all, let me start with Romilly, because that was the only question that I actually anticipated and noted down a quotation from Carolina's presentation as she was doing it, so that I would have it handy in case somebody would ask it. I think the salient point about Carolina's presentation was the following statements. The MDGs never replaced our main priorities. So it's not, the question is not whether it wasn't useful for the government to say, now there's this international agenda. We are doing, let's say, primary education anyway, and now somebody from the UN is stopping by and is saying, we are doing this on a much larger scale, at a much higher level. We have a lot of ideas that we are willing to share with you. We are collecting all this information, and so the government of Colombia would say, well, that's great. We have that in our National Development Plan anyway, and now we're calling it the MDG. And we don't call it the National...
I don't know how that happened. You exposed your taste in music.
And I think on that level that is completely fine. And that's indeed, if you find these areas of congruence, then I think this would be great. And I would actually say that if what you are saying is a realistic prospect, that the SDG agenda is basically a long sort of Christmas shopping list that you are being given, and then you get to pick to choose which presents to actually buy, and then put an international sort of pot of resources behind it and international support behind it, then why not? Because it wouldn't have a mechanism that sort of expects of governments to decide how to reconcile these things with all the other, as Carolina said, with all the other priorities that they would also have. It's not saying anything about which of these need to be given priorities over other things, or how do you reconcile any internal contradictions. And you can have a conversation about whether the MDGs, which are sort of very limited and very basic, are maybe a more feasible thing that more countries could agree on. But that's sort of a separate conversation, because obviously when you talk about things like, again, accountable, transparent, and participatory institutions, that to me sounds like something very, very specific, or at least I have a specific image of that. That to me is very different from, let's say, basic education. Because if you're saying what we all agree on basic education, it might be because you as a government want your children in basic education to be smart. It might be that you don't want them to be educated by sort of private suppliers of education. It might be that you want them to be well fed, and the best place to do that is the school. It might be that you can have all sorts of ambitions why you want to provide basic education to people who don't necessarily have something to do with education. So I think this the transformation of the SDGs into essentially anything and everything under the sun. Sure, if that then becomes a menu, that's all right, because then who cares about how much of that actually gets picked up. But I would assume that if you, and I printed it out so that I'd be able to cite from it. If you have something that you call a goal, and then have under each goal something like 10, 8, 9, 15 different measurable targets, then that suggests to me that if you sign under the dotted line on page 24, that you're somehow signing up to the entire thing. And that is what I'm objecting to, because the signing up to the entire thing is definitely not going to be something which sort of any percentage of actual people in power are going to be realistically aspiring to. Or they wouldn't have wanted that otherwise, and I don't think that the international community has any means to make them so. And then what are we wasting our time on? I just wanted to make another point about what Dirk was saying. I think it's still very much to be decided exactly whether this is going to be more like a trade agreement, more like a Christmas shopping list, or something else entirely. But I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with your notion of that sometimes this is also a good thing. like trade agreements in the sense that it limits ownership and it keeps governments from doing stupid things. That would be entirely fine with me as long as I get to decide what the stupid thing is. But if it's not that, then this is going to be very, very problematic, because every government has its own definition of what the stupid things are. And this isn't about whether they are actually stupid or not. It's whether you can make them change their behavior based on your interpretation of what is stupid, when the only lever that you have is essentially sort of moral pressure and aid, because there's no other way of enforcing any of that stuff. And if you are the European Union, for instance, then obviously they are thinking that they are protecting their very frail and fragile and exposed agricultural producers by subsidizing them, and that's entirely a good thing. And so it's not about whether these are actually good ideas or not. I think there's very little in the SDGs that I would think this is just morally abhorrent, and I can't believe that anybody would come up with such an agenda. But I'm not presuming that I'm speaking for 6 billion people, and I guess that's kind of the point. So I think if international agencies were sort of being honest about the fact that in promoting something like this, you're essentially becoming a domestic interest group that speaks for a particular agenda and has certain means and certain opportunities available the way that any other domestic interest group would be, then I think that would be a great place to be. But as far as I'm aware of these conversations in the sort of donor coordination meetings and the budget support conversations where all of that stuff is going to be implemented in years into the future, those are not the discussions that we are having. The discussions that we are having is that you need to do this and you need to put it into your budget because you signed up to the SDGs and because this is the right thing to do. And that's not a very realistic way of making sure that they actually happen.
Okay, we have another nearly 50 minutes for discussion. And I think as much as I love to have ODI colleagues on record furiously but very elegantly disagreeing with one another, it would be really nice now to hear other voices too. So I would like to give priorities to our guests. Although I have a question, but I need to I need to force myself not to ask it.
Pelle Persson from SIDA. I want to go back to the title of this session on managing external and domestic financing flows, and ask, particularly from South Africa or Colombia, if you have good examples on how you have attracted private funds for development, be it the MDGs or whatever the targets we could argue about should be there. But if you could give some examples, I think it would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. More? One at the back over there.
Thanks. Mike Williams. I'm an independent consultant. I had some money from ODI 45 years ago, but I'll give me that. I wanted to ask and follow up on a very detailed point from Neil Cole's presentation, which is about making sure that your data and your management of external flows actually goes through the government accounts. A lot of progress has been made on that in recent years. It's essential, of course, for planning purposes, debt sustainability, debt strategy, and so on. But I do wonder whether looking forward everything's going to get worse. We've already had problems. We don't really know the detail of some of the very substantial flows from China, for example, the risk characteristics and so on. We were talking this morning about sovereign bonds. A number of those have actually flowed in through public corporations and have not appeared in central government data. Sometimes it's been amendment after pressure from donors. We're looking forward to PPPs, generate contingent liabilities. I should perhaps say in passing that Colombia is ahead of its peer group in its ability to analyze and monitor PPPs, but a lot of other countries have difficulty not only with the analysis, but monitoring what's happening and maintaining a database which they can analyze in risk terms. the more innovative forms of private finance are going to add to that issue. So it does seem to me that we're moving into an area or an era of less transparency.
Thank you. One there at the front.
My name is Dal Craven and I work for Irish Aid, and I have a question for Neil as well. You emphasised the requirement for, or the necessity of using country systems. And my question is, how can we incentivise both DAC and non-DAC donors to use country systems and use the budget process? Thanks.
Thank you. There's one more here on the left.
Ruth Kelly from ActionAid. I'm just picking up on a point that Carolina and I were discussing at the break, actually. So there's a lot of new mechanisms that seem to be very difficult to manage, and you talked particularly about the expense of PPPs, how expensive they were in the future. And these are mechanisms that developed or industrialized OECD countries have also found difficult to manage, including the UK. And in OECD countries also found it difficult to manage financial systems. And I just feel like there's a point here around kind of, and I don't know quite what the question is, but it's around the fact that we're getting into a space where we're talking about the way that developing countries should manage flows as though it's easy, when it's actually a challenge that everyone is facing. And I wonder if there are any reflections that the panel has on the fact that OECD countries have also found this really challenging.
Thank you. One there, the centre. And then maybe we'll take one more and I'll go back to the panel for some final comments.
Thanks. I'm Lisa Wise from Save the Children. I was just thinking in terms of the discussion about the impact that the MDGs have had in country contexts. One of the things that is often talked about is the fact that they've given a platform for civil societies, for example, to push for certain priorities, perhaps to push for transparency in public spending or more attention to certain issues in the budget. So I was just wondering, the cases we got here from South Africa and Colombia, whether domestic civil society organisations and movements have used that international platform to push for different priorities, and whether that's affected kind of the planning processes, and then broader reflections on whether the SDG framework therefore there might be potential for it to have a positive impact in that sense.
Thank you. If there is one last question, if not, we can get back to the panel. We have a nice cluster of questions about the realities of the in-country systems and managing finances, and these last questions around civil society. Shall we start with you, Neil?
Yeah. It was a round of far more interesting questions than the first round of ODI questions.
we can continue. We'll continue to entertain you with that.
There are some good and bad examples of private financial flows that have funded things that governments are expected to typically, or that governments traditionally do. There's the Lesotho provincial hospital that was in the capital, Maseru. I mean that was funded through a PPP, and also the administration of the hospital. And there's some difficulties with it now in that it is being run like a private hospital in the sense that it's quite expensive to receive certain treatments at the hospital, which was not the intention. It was intended to be a public hospital. I mean, we've looked at several water reticulation plants across Africa, Egypt in particular, that have been financed through PPPs. And then most of South African roads, or the major roads, are now being done through private sector involvement, where the user pays the fees, as in the case of the very popular e-tolling road in one of our provinces. And and I'm not sure whether this would be, contributing towards development, but most government accommodation is now being done through PPPs. I mean, I fully agree. I think that it's on the question of, are things going to become a lot less transparent? I don't think my starting point would be that things are going to become a lot less transparent. Where I would start is to say that if governments don't understand how complex things are going to become, then I think things are going to become a lot less transparent. So it's about developing capabilities and understanding of different types of financial flows, and where many governments are struggling, with a budget process that at the moment only has some domestic resources and the difference made up in ODA, and they're really struggling with that. With all these new and different types of financial flows, I think there's going to be, governments are going to struggle. I mean, if I think of South Africa's first public-private partnership, which was the train between Johannesburg and Pretoria, about 45 kilometers between the two. I mean, that was far too complex for anyone within government to undertake. And the capacity to undertake that was capacity that the Treasury had to bring in. And which I think was the correct decision that we made at the time. Maybe just one more on the question on the incentives to move towards use of country systems. I think there are two things that will help. The first is to not take a blanket approach in terms of the aid modality. So to say that any form of aid modality can lead to or accommodate an increase in country systems. It does not only have to be budget support. And linked to that, we need to break up the public finance management cycle into its various components. Because in taking that approach, you will start to understand better the fiduciary risk that vary across the cycle. So for instance, there's less fiduciary risk in putting aid on plan than, say, putting aid into the Treasury and putting aid onto the audit. And then the second, I think, which is very important, I mean, this point that I made about meaningful dialogues taking place, this is going to have to be resolved at a country level. A dialogue that happens at a country level that determines which of the country systems are going to be used, where some systems are stronger than others, and where the fiduciary risk is less than, say, in others.
Thank you, Neil. Carolina, Philip, I need to ask you to be a little bit brief because we are running out of time. So maybe one point each. You can go back to the bumblebee, perhaps. At the end of
I guess in terms of foreign direct investment, because I think it's not only PPPs but also foreign direct investment and flows of new companies going into countries that will allow also to create jobs and reduce poverty. Like, we have to be broad in thinking on that way. I think in Colombia, basically, it's a result of many things in which, as I said before lunch, macroeconomics is key. You have to be a good country for investors to go. For us, in our case, improvements in security were needed, because if not, we will not have the companies going to invest. And a policy oriented to making business, doing business policy. We made a lot of things to do business in Colombia, something easier. I think that worked. In terms of PPPs, We have now experience because we have been very unsuccessful in the past with PPPs. We are in the 4th generation of PPPs in roads. That means that 3 generations have not really succeeded very well. And it's very complicated. So that is something that I think is an opportunity, but I don't think it will happen from one day to another. And one thing that we have been not successful, for example, pension funds in Colombia, and Colombian pension funds of Colombians have around $80 billion. Since 2006, we have been trying for them to invest in roads. 2014 have not invested in one road. So it is a process that takes time. And the other domestic civil society, yes, I think it opens. Dialogue was open through the MDGs to NGOs, to civil society, because of the international players who invited external players to the policy making. It was not normal to do it like that, and I think it's a positive result of this international architecture.
Thank you, Carolina. Philip, you have the last word.
Well, I didn't get a second round of earfuls of violent disagreement, so I think I can just indulge in a little bit of PFM geekery and just think about this PPP question. What I think is important about this is that in OECD countries, you would think about PPPs as, well, it's just another weapon that you have in your arsenal, but it's not particularly special, and it's not super great or super awful. And so there might be situations where it's appropriate. It has the fantastic benefit for governments, of course, that it's a great instrument to push contingent liabilities and costs onto the shoulders of future generations and keep it out of your budget in the present. But it's also about what's your capacity to actually implement, for instance, road construction projects, as opposed to your capacity to oversee people doing road construction projects. If all your road engineers are already busy building roads, and then you have smart people who are very good at overseeing PPPs and do that in a way that they are not being duped out of money by the contractors, then that seems like a pretty solid way to go. But it's not on its own. It's not really generating money that wouldn't otherwise be there. The costs are going to be located in different places, and the management challenges are different between contracting out stuff and doing it yourself. But that's really all there is to it.
Thank you. So I think we are running a little bit late, so we'll leave it at that. So we went from the chimera to the PPP at the end, and I think this is a good span to cover in the final session where we try to make sense of all of this and translate all this into policy recommendation for the SDGs. Thank you all.